20th, 1969, less than a decade after John F. Kennedy challenged a nation to reach for the moon, the world watched three Americans do just that and heard the unforgettable words, "The Eagle has landed." Our number one story, mankind's giant leap 40 years later. Kennedy's promise fulfilled, with 600 million witnessing man's first footprints on lunar soil. Neil Armstrong would later say about his monumental achievement, "The unknowns were rampant." But the imagery of Apollo 11 is now iconic. The American flag planted, the plaque left behind stating, "We came in peace for all mankind." Today, the International Space Station marking the anniversary with a spacewalk of its own to do some repair work. While this afternoon, the men of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins met with President Obama. Mr. Obama called the trio genuine American heroes and expressed gratitude for what they achieved that historic day. Our correspondent is Tom Costello.
40 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust.
Even today, 40 years later, we seem to hold our breath when we see it.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Through a miracle of 1969 technology, NASA had defied the odds and landed two men on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
600 million people around the world watched live as Neil Armstrong and then Buzz Aldrin took those first steps.
Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Only 12 men ever walked on the moon, the last in 1972. The U.S. had won a key battle in the Cold War. Today, the Apollo 11 command module sits at the Air and Space Museum in Washington.
By winning that space race, we demonstrated to our allies and potential allies, and indeed the whole world, that the United States was second to none when it came to science and technology.
NBC's Jay Barbary has covered every U.S. manned mission ever launched. He's still on the job today.
The hardest thing that people of knowledge had to try to understand was, why did we go to the moon and then abandon it?
Politics got in the way, hardly what Stanley Kubrick envisioned in 2001, A Space Odyssey. Last year in Cleveland, the normally reserved Neil Armstrong spoke about those first few minutes on the lunar surface.
And what we found out was that by the time we had just stood around in the cockpit for a couple hours, we were completely adapted. And when we walked down off of the craft onto the surface, we already were right at home. And you'd really like it.
40 years later, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins remain heroes.
NBC's Tom Costello reporting. 4 decades after that historic journey, one of the Apollo 11 men is urging Americans and NASA to be bold and explore the true unknown. At a news conference earlier today, Buzz Aldrin, the second man to step on lunar soil, said the best way to commemorate the 40th anniversary is not to replay the past, but to make some new history.
America to Mars is what ought to be, not America back to the moon. America can use our experience, great experience, and the last 4 years of experience in detailed preparation for us to go. We can share that with somebody else. Let's do that.
And in an op-ed within the New York Daily News, Aldrin explained the red planet can reap rich rewards. Mars, as our focus, can electrify the public's interest in science and engineering, give our young people something to stimulate their educational goals, and provide a rationale for global American space leadership. Aldrin also argues that the moon race was won 40 years ago. We've become fixated on the moon, but having been there and stood on its surface, I can tell you that the moon is a dead end for NASA. Joining us now is Derek Petz, Chief Astronomer at the Franklin Institute of Science Museum. And Derek, good evening.
How are you, David?
Good. Does Mr. Aldrin have a point? Should we forget the moon and focus on Mars? And what is the likelihood of us seeing a mission to Mars in the near future?
I think the real way to frame it, David, is that Mars should be the long-term goal that we want to try to achieve. I mean, it is a long reach out, and it does present all sorts of technological challenges, but it's not to say that it can't be done. The way I would put it is that if we make Mars the long-term goal, then what we end up with is a lot of technological development that has to happen between now and then. That would probably include returning to the moon just so we can build up our chops for doing this space exploration out on other planets. You know, know, it was 40 years ago that we last had people on the moon. So what's the possibility that this is going to happen? Well, a lot depends on what the national commissions that advise the president tell him we should set as a goal. And then from there, it's a question of whether or not the funding is provided to make that happen.
Today, astronauts from other Apollo missions referred to the International Space Station as a white elephant. Is cost going to be the biggest factor in NASA's future missions?
Cost is always a factor no matter how you look at it, and the reason why is because the only way you can mitigate risk in these very, very high-risk situations is to provide the proper backup to try to cut down on the risk, and that means it's expensive. But when you really look at the cost of this, David, it's not that much. Everybody always talks about how expensive the space program is, but you have to realize that NASA's budget overall is 14th or 15th out of the top 20 items in the U.S. budget. So it's not really a lot. It's 1 penny of every tax dollar spent. So that's not a lot for the kind of achievement we get out of it.
Humans haven't been to the moon since 1972, as we saw in Tom Costello's piece. Were these moon missions less about science and exploration and more about beating Russia?
I think at the outset they really were about beating Russia. But as we realized that Russia was not really going to be able to mount much challenge for this, it really did turn into science. And it was realized that if we are going to do this as a way to beat the Russians, we can also make hay out of this by going for the science. So in the collecting of the, 840 pounds of rocks that was the total amount brought back, we learned a tremendous amount about the history of the solar system, particularly about the history of the moon and our Earth. We also got a chance to look back at the Earth in a way that we never had before that gave us a totally new realization and understanding of how finite this planet and its resources are.
Today, President Obama was non-committal about future space exploration. No mention of Mars or returning to the moon. Are our best decades of space shots already behind us?
No, they really aren't behind us, but it requires that we identify a goal and that we decide that we really want to pursue these goals so that we can open up this sort of exploration again. We always have to remember that the kind of exploration that was required for the missions to the moon really is an inherent part of human experience and human traits. So we want to explore, and we probably will continue to do so.
And Derek, I wonder if you can put in perspective how much easier the technology is now in terms of going to the moon or going to the Mars than it was 40 years ago.
I would put it like this, David. There is 64 times the amount of computing power in your cell phone than was in all of the computers used on any of the Apollo missions.
So interesting. Well, Derek, we appreciate you coming on. Derek Pitts of the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. Derek, many thanks. We appreciate you coming on tonight on this historic anniversary. 40 years since man landed on the moon. Who would have believed? Amazing.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.
You're welcome.